Welcome to the first episode of Homocapitalism podcast on markets, liberalism, and LGBTQ freedom. Today, I'm joined by Nathan Goodman, a political economist whose work examines liberal institutions, radical political economy, and LGBTQ emancipation. This conversation is based on two of his works, A Radical Liberal Approach to LGBTQ Emancipation, and his co-authored paper with Alex Craig, Gender as an Institution, LGBT plus Identities and Economic Coordination. Nathan, welcome to the first episode of Homocapitalism.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to begin with a broad argument of your paper, A Radical Liberal Approach to LGBTQ Emancipation. One thing I found striking is that you do not explain LGBTQ emancipation only through courts, law, or activism. You place markets, civil societies, experimentation, and liberal institutions at the center of the story. For a general audience, what is the basic argument of that paper?
Yeah, so the basic argument of that paper is, first, liberal institutions have been an important part of expanding LGBTQ freedom. And as you note, part of the stuff that people might see as an important component of that relates to courts and law and legislation, right? So the Supreme Court overturned bans on gay marriage, overturned sodomy laws, right? These are situations where liberal institutions of checks and balances and of having judicial review expand LGBTQ freedom. But beyond these formal rules, I emphasize, as you note, that having a society where people are free to experiment, where they're free to start their own businesses, where they're free to form civil society groups, this is an important part of how LGBTQ freedom was expanded. So it's Pride Month, and part of the reason that it's Pride Month right now in June, as I'm talking to you, is that in late June, in the late 1960s, there was a riot at a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn after they were raided by police. Well, note, how do you have a gay bar, right? You have a gay bar because somebody invested in starting a business, right? A gay bar is not a project that's usually run as a activist project solely, or as a charitable project or a mutual aid project, though in principle you could run it on those principles. But typically a gay bar is a commercial establishment. And that was the case for the Stonewall Inn, right? The Stonewall Inn was, prior to becoming a gay bar, a sort of middling to failing business, a bar and grill serving heteronormative audiences. Someone with the mafia named Tony Lauria saw a profit opportunity there. He purchased the Stonewall Inn, or converted it into a private bottle club that catered to the LGBTQ community. And so that pivotal flashpoint in LGBTQ community formation in the US, that then led to a confrontation with the police, that then was celebrated with a set of pride celebrations that continue to this day, that was a result in part of commercial entrepreneurship. The same is true of all the other gay bars around the world. It's true of LGBTQ bookstores and publishers. It's true of those who sell condoms, sex toys, HIV medication, various other medical services that are tailored to the needs of LGBTQ people, gender-affirming care, right? A huge amount of that takes place through the commercial sector, right? It takes place through people not having to get government permission for whatever they want to do with scarce productive resources, but instead being able to take their own resources and use them to start a business that might cater to a subset of the population that's heavily stigmatized. So that's the first part of the argument, is liberalism has expanded LGBTQ freedom. Then I engage with some radical LGBTQ critics of liberalism. So some people will say, look, you can have formally equal rights, but functionally very disparate sets of institutions, right? So maybe on paper, the rules say that we affirm the freedom of queer, trans, gay, bisexual, lesbian, etc. people, right? You have a 14th Amendment, you have a set of Supreme Court rulings, but maybe in practice, the cops are homophobic, or they profile trans women of color as sex workers, or the prison guards lock people in cages where they're vulnerable to sexual violence, right? Or maybe you have good laws on the books, but there's discrimination by employers or landlords that makes it hard for LGBTQ people to find housing or find work, right? All of these things can happen. And so you could have liberal rules, but authoritarian and unequal patterns of outcomes that might arise from structures that are legitimized through liberalism. And so this is a critique that's been made by various socialist, Marxist, and anarchist queer and trans activists, right? I heavily rely in that chapter on the work of Dean Spade, who comes from the sort of anarchist perspective. And I say that there's a lot to this critique, right? I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand. I think that it's true that you can have formally egalitarian rules, but very inegalitarian practices. And that sometimes this arises from certain features of institutions that we call liberals, especially the liberal democratic state, for example, right? But then I say, okay, just because you have a radical critique of the status quo because of various injustices that take place during it, even when there's these formally egalitarian rules, right? That doesn't necessarily tell you what institutions you should replace it with. And so I then argue that we should use economics to analyze how institutions work and what the feasible space of institutions look like. And so I first say that the tools of economics can reinforce some elements of the radical critique, right? So looking at the ways in which politically connected businesses seek special privileges from the state through what economists call rent seeking, that can tell us a lot about things like violence against LGBTQ people in prisons, or abusive behavior by police, or harms associated with militarism. Some of these things that are very much in the foreground for the radical LGBTQ critics of liberalism, right? And so I say first, these economic tools can strengthen these radical arguments. But then second, many LGBTQ radical critics of liberalism want to replace it with a system that completely abolishes private property rights in productive property, private property rights in capital, right? And if you do that, I argue, you're going to run into a couple problems. First, if you do it through a state, that reproduces exactly the sort of concentrated power that we're worried about when it comes to the police officer who will maybe profile a trans woman as a sex worker and then abuse her, right? That type of concentrated power then is held in the communist state. And I discussed some history of states like Cuba and China engaging in various forms of anti-LGBTQ repression. And then I say, okay, but there certainly are some anti-capitalists who would say, yeah, I repudiate all of that. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. I think those states are actually better understood as state capitalist, right? And so then I introduce a stronger critique, which is called the economic calculation problem. And the basic point here is, if you can exchange productive property for money, then you're going to get prices for productive property. This is going to enable you to use those prices to learn where scarce resources are going to create more value or less value. And this enables people to coordinate productive activity from the bottom up rather than with top-down command and control. And so I argue that if you get rid of that, even if you try to get rid of that in a manner that involves a, more dispersed or democratic or libertarian or anti-authoritarian form of socialism, if you get rid of the ability to form and discover prices for productive property, you're going to lead to a situation that's likely to impoverish people, including LGBTQ people, and that might make it harder for people to pursue the kinds of projects that, as we just discussed, have been helpful for expanding LGBTQ freedom. And then finally, I argue that we should synthesize liberalism with the radical critique. So the radical critique contains very good criticisms of, for instance, police, prisons, militaries, politically connected capitalists, right? Special privileges held by those who are wealthy and powerful, right? And I say these are good critiques, but we need exchangeable productive property so that we can get prices, so that we can get entrepreneurial experimentation, so that people can start gay bars, all these sorts of things, right? And so I argue that a particular form of radical liberalism associated with individualist anarchism, of a tradition that's associated with some, especially 19th century American individualist anarchists like Benjamin Tucker and Voltairine de Cleyre, offers a potential synthesis between the aspects of liberalism that have led to expanded LGBTQ freedom and some of the radical criticisms of existing liberal states, existing capitalist societies, and so on. So that's basically the core argument, is liberalism has expanded LGBTQ freedom. Some radicals are still critical of the liberal institutions we've had. Those radicals have a point, but we need to be realistic about the types of possibilities and the potential unintended consequences of radical social change. And the way to satisfy some of the radical concerns while also keeping the benefits of liberalism is through a kind of individualist anarchism that radicalizes the liberal commitments to voluntary association, free markets, open inquiry, open competition, and checks and balances and federalism, right?
Yeah. One of the most accessible parts of your chapter is the idea that markets are not just about buying and selling. They are also social spaces. You discuss things like gay bar, magazines, community organizations, fashion, and related goods and spaces. So, how have markets helped LGBTQ people find each other, build communities, and create forms of identity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that this is a really important aspect of markets that often gets neglected. So a lot of people look at markets through kind of a sterile lens, right? So you go to an economics class and you learn about markets by doing math equations and solving some optimization problems using calculus on the board. And you say, okay, well, that's markets, I guess. It's a bunch of people who are just interacting solely on the basis of prices and solely to maximize their individual returns, right? And so some of the social elements of markets can get neglected if you do that. But as my colleague Virgil Storr argues, the market is a social space, right? So what does he mean by this? Well, think about going to work, participating in a workplace. You're interacting with a lot of the same people repeatedly. People often form friendships in the workplace. People often form pretty close social ties in the workplace. And even if they don't form close social ties, they form genuine social ties that are meaningful to them, right? And the same is often true for certain types of businesses that create social spaces for consumers, right? So you may, with your group of friends, every week go to the same bar or the same coffee shop. And that might be an important part of how you form community ties. And that's certainly been true for LGBTQ communities, right? This is quite clear with the history of gay bars, as we've discussed. It's also clear sometimes with coffee shops serving this function. So just anecdotally, when I was growing up in Salt Lake City, Utah, the Utah Pride Center, which is a major LGBTQ nonprofit and community space, they had their offices adjacent to a coffee shop that served as a pretty significant LGBTQ community space, right? So that coffee shop was sustained largely through what coffee shops are sustained by: selling coffee and baked goods and similar items like tea to willing customers. And that created a comfortable space where people could be themselves, where people could form social ties with others who shared their identity, right? And that was really important, especially in Utah at that point in time, because Utah is a very socially conservative state. The dominant religion in Utah is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church. And the LDS Church doesn't recognize same-sex marriage as legitimate, doesn't recognize transition as legitimate, right? There, especially at that time, were kids, teenagers who had been kicked out by their parents after they came out, right? And so community spaces like this were really important for people. And I think a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life have similar stories of a coffee shop or a bar, or potentially a gaming shop or some other space that served an important role for LGBTQ people who might otherwise not be able to find other people who have similar experiences, similar identities to them, right? And might find themselves outcast by society. So when people are free to start these types of entrepreneurial ventures and create new uses of space where people can go and meet like-minded people, that can be really important for those who dissent from prevailing norms.
As you were mentioning before, like during the reply to the first question, you clearly mentioned that you take radical queer critique seriously. But also you argue that the mainline economics gives a better explanation of the institutional failures radicals are worried about. So the solution is not less liberalism, but a more radical liberalism. Where do you think the radical queer and trans critics of liberalism are right? And where do you think they go wrong, especially when they reject markets or private property altogether? I think you mentioned it briefly, but like if you could give a more specific response to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the radical critics get a lot right, as I said, and what they get right is that the presence of a set of rules on paper is not necessarily enough to have genuine emancipation or liberation. So you could have a set of Supreme Court rulings that say, okay, sodomy laws have been struck down, same-sex marriage is legal, right? You could have a police department that has an LGBTQ liaison unit and tries to build better relationships with LGBTQ members of the community, make it so that crime victims who are LGBTQ feel safe to report crimes to the police, and so on. You can have a set of anti-discrimination laws that say it's illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in hiring or in housing, right? You can have all of these things on paper, but in practice, people with discretionary power are likely to act on their biases and values in a manner that means that the presence of certain kinds of discretionary power can lead to inequality, can lead to injustice, and can lead to oppression. So the way to think about this is to, for example, look at policing, right? You could have a bunch of formally equal laws, and you could have a set of cops, some of whom are LGBTQ, who form a LGBTQ police liaison unit. But then you also have some vice cops who have been on the beat for a while and have come to hold the view that trans women of color are especially likely to be sex workers. And so when they walk through certain districts of the downtown and they see a visibly transgender woman, especially one who's a woman of color, they might hassle her, they might harass her, they might even sexually assault her, treat her possession of condoms as evidence of a crime. They might arrest her once she's arrested. They might put her in a position where she's vulnerable to sexual violence. And they might do that, put her in a position where she's vulnerable to sexual violence, even after we have laws with names like the Prison Rape Elimination Act, for example, right? And so that's a situation where you have discretionary power that means that even when the rules on paper are egalitarian, neutral, even pro-LGBTQ, the words that the law says about us aren't necessarily enough to protect us from the violence of those empowered by law, would I think be the way that some of the queer radicals would put it. So that I think is what they get right. And I think where they go wrong is they're not just seeing that concentrated power in the state. And I think they're right to see it more widely, but they're also seeing that concentrated power in property owners, right? So you can have anti-discrimination law, but you also have some people own a business and other people need to be employed by a business. And that gives the owner, the employer, power over the worker, right? Some people own multiple homes and rent out some of them, and other people need to rent a place in order to live, right? In order to have shelter. And so that creates a power disparity between the landlord and the prospective tenant, right? And each of these are things that can give rise to discrimination, to oppression, and so on because of the discretionary power held by the property owner. So they're right to identify that, but where they often go wrong is then saying, and therefore we need to abolish that private property because that private property creates the discretionary power over other people. And therefore, if we abolish the private property, we will have abolished that power disparity. And then we can achieve a society where everyone gets everything they need, right? That's the vision. And it's an appealing vision. It's normatively appealing. I just don't think it's feasible because of the benefits of private property for allowing experimentation, for enabling price discovery, and therefore for enabling prices to give people signals about the relative scarcity and relative demand for different scarce resources in a manner that enables us to coordinate our plans with each other without relying on top-down discretionary authority of any single collective, right? If we rely on a single collective, whether it calls itself the state or whether it calls itself the Federated Regional People's Commune, right? That singular collective is going to have a lot of discretionary power to exert control over whoever is not popular within the assembly or group or cadre that controls that. And so that's going to potentially generate more problems for marginalized people rather than fewer problems for marginalized people.
That's actually my favorite part. And I think that's the coolest part of the whole argument. And moving on, you don't use the sexual state framework, but your work does speak directly how state institutions, policing, borders, and legal systems shape LGBTQ vulnerability and freedom. How should LGBTQ politics think about state as a protector, a threat, a necessary institution, or something more complicated?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think part of the answer is descriptively states do all of these things, right? I think every state that exists is a threat to the freedom of people that it claims the power to exercise violence over, right? And so whether that's a police officer or a prison guard or a soldier, right? Every state relies on violent coercive authority. And part of what makes it a state is that violence is socially legitimized, right? And because the state has a monopoly on the socially legitimate use of force, any defensive force by others against that force would be treated as illegitimate and criminal, right? So that creates a very dangerous center of power, which can be used and has been used by police officers, by prison guards, and so on to really brutally oppress LGBTQ people, right? So that I think is the first most salient fact. Then the second salient fact is that states can in fact act as protectors, right? So they can leverage that violence, that coercion, against non-state actors who engage in predatory violence. And so there certainly are cases where abusers or people who engage in anti-LGBTQ hate crimes and assaults have been arrested and prosecuted and convicted and incarcerated by states, right? That does happen. And so that genuinely can be a protection of LGBTQ people from violence. And that's important. And I don't want to deny that reality. But what I worry about is that the concentrated power and the risks of abuse associated with it is an ineliminable part of every state. And so that even if you have a state that has some functionaries who are making good faith efforts to carry out the legitimate protective functions, you still have a system of concentrated power and socially legitimized violence that is really dangerous. And so what I'm interested in is to what extent we can build alternatives to the state so that we can get genuine rights protection without relying on this level of concentrated power and authority. And so I think in the meantime, what people should be doing is thinking very skeptically and critically about the violent exercise of state power, thinking about the ways that border guards and immigration agents are taking people, locking them in detention centers where they're vulnerable to homophobic and transphobic violence, and then deporting them to countries that, because those countries are less liberal than the countries that they immigrated to, countries where these LGBTQ people face even more severe risks of violence, right? I think that should be in the foreground of our minds as a really salient instance of state activity. And I think that we should be thinking about also the state violence that's happening in our own backyards. And we should be thinking about alternatives to the state. But still at the same time, I don't begrudge people who make efforts to have the state protect them when the state can function in a protective way. I just suggest that they should think critically about to what extent are the protections that you're getting predicated on some expansion of state power? And are there ways to get similar protection without that? Those are sort of the ways I think about it. I'd be interested to hear how you think about it and to hear how other people that you know think about it and think through potential other frameworks for looking at it. But that's kind of my way of thinking.
I think Jyoti Puri, Sexual States, Studying Indian Context, Indian Section 377 is a very interesting book, which I have recently read, and it has been quite impactful. I could see sexual states in Italy, like for example, after reading that, I could see how sexual state is being formed. So the basic argument there is that state is not just controlling individuals through this kind of laws, but a state otherwise which is getting weaker and weaker, especially after liberalizing the economy and moving away from the economy and the market. State is finding space to build itself and regrow through controlling or governing sexualities of individuals. So that's one of the arguments which I've found recently very interesting. For a non-economist audience, what does public choice theory add to LGBTQ politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, public choice theory is an analytical framework for analyzing politics using the tools of economics. So, when most people hear about economics, they think, okay, economists are people who study the economy or who study markets or who study business. But in the process of studying markets and studying business, economists developed theories of individuals making choices within conditions where those individuals have limited options and where choosing one thing means giving up another thing, right? And so as a result, economists developed theories related to how individuals operate within particular contexts and respond to the incentives they face. Public choice is the application of that body of theory to decision making in non-market settings, especially politics. And so you're using the same analytical models that you use to look at how I might act when I'm shopping at the supermarket, and you're using it to monitor or to analyze how I might act when I go into the voting booth, or if I were to lobby for a particular policy. And so what this allows us to do is to analyze public policy and politics not as something that a single unitary entity called the government or the state does, but instead as a result of a process of individuals interacting, a bunch of different voters, a bunch of different bureaucrats, a bunch of different police officers, a bunch of different legislators and judges, all interacting and responding to their incentives. And so this does give us a useful set of tools for analyzing how different public policies that are aimed to protect LGBTQ people or other vulnerable or marginalized people might actually wind up harming those people. So consider a hate crimes legislation, for example. So suppose that the government passes a law that says that when a hate crime occurs, we're going to bump that up to being a federal offense, and also we're going to give local police departments a bunch of federal funding to use for policing hate crimes, right? Well, when you do that, there's some other stuff that you do, right? So you're altering the incentives and constraints faced by the local police departments. So they, for example, now have more resources because you increase their funding, right? They also have more of their resources tied to funding from the federal government. And so that can, through this mechanism, maybe encourage them to spend more time investigating hate crimes, but maybe being dependent on the federal government might also make them more responsive to the demands of the federal government to cooperate with ICE, for example. And so if that's the case, then you've altered the incentives of the local police department in a manner that by making them more responsive to federal decision makers and less responsive to, say, local taxpayers, local citizen stakeholders, you maybe lead to them doing more to transfer immigrants that they've arrested or interacted with into ICE custody. Maybe some of those immigrants are LGBTQ and they get deported to a country where they're likely to get killed because it's a much more homophobic or transphobic and authoritarian country, right? So that could be one unintended consequence of the hate crime legislation through the way that it's altered the incentives of the local police department, right? And I'm not saying that that definitely has happened in this context, right? That's a hypothetical example where a particular chain of incentives could lead to this outcome. We would need to actually analyze the relevant institutional context and do more detailed social science to examine, hey, did hate crimes legislation of this sort contribute to the role of local police in mass deportation, for example? But that's at least a conceivable mechanism that public choice makes legible to you by examining the way that local police respond to incentives rather than simply acting as public servants or as agents of the state, right? If the police are individuals who value having a higher budget and whose budget has now become more contingent on federal transfers than on local stakeholders, then that's going to alter their incentives. And so that's one way you could use public choice to analyze how an effort to protect vulnerable people, including LGBTQ people, could actually victimize vulnerable people. And there are others that you could use, right? So you might look at a foreign military intervention that's carried out in part on grounds of humanitarian intervention against a theocratic state that's really repressive towards LGBTQ people, right? And you could say, all right, well, this is intended in part to achieve geopolitical goals, but also in part to achieve a set of goals related to freeing people from this theocracy, right? And then you might look, okay, this now means an expansion of the coercive powers and tools used by soldiers in the federal government, and it also means an expansion in the resources available to defense contractors. And those defense contractors then also lobby for increased border enforcement, increased immigration enforcement, because those defense contractors can get lucrative contracts related to working on that. And so then we get, again, more of the deportations of queer people back to situations where they're in further danger, right? So these are just hypothetical examples of how you can look at the incentives associated with a state project that might be aimed at a protective end and see how that might alter incentives in a way that could victimize vulnerable people.
Yeah. So let's now turn to your paper with Craig, Gender as an Institution. The central idea is that gender is not only identity, biology, expression, or hierarchy. It also functions as an institution because it coordinates expectations. Can you explain that in ordinary language? What does it mean to say that gender helps people coordinate social life?
Yeah, absolutely. So we all want to do different things, right? We have goals, right? So we're interacting in the world, and in order to achieve our goals, we need to cooperate with other people, right? Most of our life projects are not life projects that we can pursue alone, right? They're life projects that we pursue with others. And what we're arguing is that one function institutions serve is that they help people pursue their life projects in a way that works well with the life projects of others and enables them to cooperate, rather than leading to their life projects coming into conflict with each other. So a traffic light is one example of an institution in this sense, right? So you drive up to the traffic light, and if the light's green, you go. If the light's red, you stop. If the light's yellow, you slow down. And what this enables the different drivers, all of whom are trying to get to different places, to do is to get to their destinations without crashing into each other. Well, now let's think about some other things that people try to do where gender might be a salient way of coordinating expectations. Many people want to have children. Many people want to have a household where some stuff is done within the household, right? Many people want to have romantic and sexual relationships with people, right? Many people might want to divide up labor within those households in certain ways. And so if, in order to figure out whether you could do that with somebody, you needed to every time renegotiate a bunch of different expectations, say, hey, I'm looking to invest in this household production project, and I'm thinking that I like washing dishes. And so I'm looking for somebody who might be into instead taking out the trash. And I also might like to bundle this with a reproductive project where I have a kid with the person that I'm engaging in joint household production with, right? Like, if you have to articulate all of that each time, that's going to be really costly and frankly kind of awkward, right? But if instead we have a set of courtship rituals in our society where people can ask somebody else out on a date, and who they ask out on a date is shaped by the gender that that person presents as, and that tells you something about which social roles people are likely to take on within a household division of labor, about likelihood of being able to have a kid together, and so on, then that's going to be a set of social expectations, a set of institutions that enables people to coordinate their plans. We base this analysis partially on a book by the philosopher Kaylin O'Connor called The Origins of Unfairness, where she argues that gender is used to solve these types of coordination games for things like reproduction and household production, but that this predictably leads to certain types of power asymmetries associated with patriarchy. What we add to her analysis is that there might be some people who have preferences, and in fact, not might be, there are some people who have preferences that diverge from those that are usually expressed by the dominant coordinating mechanism used in society for this, right? So there are some people, for instance, who would prefer to engage in romantic and sexual relationships and potentially joint household production with someone of the same gender or sex rather than someone of the opposite gender or sex, right? Some of these people might also want to have a child together, engage in child rearing together. There also are some people who maybe have preferences about which of these two sort of socially coded types they are perceived as, and those preferences might diverge from the expectations that are had of them since childhood on the basis of their anatomy, right? So those are transgender people. And what we argue is that, yes, these people do act in a manner that involves dissenting from the prevailing institutions in their society, and but they don't just wind up moving towards an institutionless world, right? They're not typically gender abolitionists or people who are moving towards, well, in a queer relationship, you negotiate all of these things explicitly. Instead, there's a new set of institutions that serve these similar gendered functions, that serve these similar coordinating functions. And we talk about these in contexts like the Hydra transgender communities, right? Some of these like household dynamics among essentially, it might be anachronistic to say this, but people who have a role fairly similar to that of a transgender woman, right? We also talk about this to some extent, though I'm not sure how much we get into this paper, in how queer relationships are coordinated, right? So same-sex marriage offers one way to use very similar institutions to what have been used in heteronormative society for this type of plan coordination. There also are more emergent bottom-up examples of this, right? So, for example, butch and femme dynamics, or being able to discuss, hey, are you a top or a bottom, or are you verse, right? Like that helps with plan coordination and is easier to say than directly explicitly describing your preferences about sex acts, right? And so a set of norms emerge within queer communities that serve this similar coordinating function is basically what we're arguing. And so gender as an institution can work even for those who dissent from their society's dominant set of gendered institutions, is essentially the argument we're making.
So is a part of LGBTQ community building the creation of new norms that reduce the cost of being understood by others?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really great way of putting it. I'm not sure if we use that type of framing in the paper, but I think that is a really great way of articulating it, right? If you were just some lone dissenter seeking another lone dissenter who wanted to pursue a type of relationship similar to yours, but there wasn't a shared language for talking about that type of relationship, or there weren't community spaces for people interested in that type of relationship, life would be a lot harder than if you have LGBTQ communities and community spaces that can serve to communicate these norms, offer people a space where they can act in a manner that uses these norms to coordinate plans and so on. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a huge benefit of LGBTQ communities.
Why was expanding marriage more successful than creating a separate institution for same-sex relationships?
Yeah, so I think part of it is that the transaction costs associated with coordinating around it were lower, because you could simply take an existing set of rules that were understood by people throughout society and just expand those rules and who they could apply to, right? Whereas if you articulate some entirely novel set of rules, that requires more effort on the uptake, right? It requires more effort both on the part of the essentially social entrepreneurs who are engaged in institutional artisanship, and on the part of other people who are trying to properly understand your relationship and how that relationship fits within your life and your life plans, right? So expanding marriage means you have something that you can easily explain to your insurance company, to your employer, to the hospital that you're trying to visit, right? If I say, this is my spouse, that's going to be different than if I say, this is my word that the nurse at the hospital has never heard, right? If I, and this can be a problem for some people for whom the expansion of marriage doesn't necessarily offer protection to everyone in the relationship, right? So people who are polyamorous, for example, if I were to go to the hospital and say, hey, I want to visit this person, they're my metamor, right? Which is a term that polyamorous people use to describe people who are essentially their partners. it's distinctly possible that the nurse at the hospital won't know what that word means and will say, "What are you talking about? I don't understand." Whereas if you say, "Hey, I'm going to the hospital and I need to visit this person. This is my husband, or this is my wife, or this is my spouse," right? That is something that they do understand because there's already a long-standing institution and history there. And so that is, I think, one. And I think this also fits into the conversation with the radical queer critics that we were talking about earlier, right? Because a lot of those folks are averse to what they see as assimilation. You know, why are you trying to assimilate into the dominant institutions of heteronormative society? Those are oppressive institutions. And often they are. But those oppressive institutions serve some set of coordinating functions and give you a way to make yourself intelligible and understandable to other people in a manner that might mean that your relationship can be stable and can flourish in a society where you have to live with other people.
Reading both the papers together, I see your projects as moving LGBTQ politics away from a narrow legal rights framework towards a broader institutional framework. LGBTQ freedom depends not only on what law says, but on whether people have the social, economic, and institutional space to experiment, coordinate, and build their lives on their own terms. Is that a fair reading of your work? And if so, what does LGBTQ emancipation ultimately require? Legal reform, cultural change, market freedom, civil society, or all of this together?
Thank you. I think that was beautifully said, and you're spot on about what I'm trying to get at here. So thank you so much. I think, to your point, it's an all of the above approach, right? So if you have oppressive laws that treat people in a fundamentally unequal way based on who they are or who they love or what their gender identity is, right? That is going to generate problems. And so legal equality is an important part of emancipation, but so is social and economic freedom so that people can experiment and build up a set of alternative institutions that enables those who dissent from dominant norms to form community and social cooperation with each other, right? So is cultural change that means that people aren't just respected when it comes to the words on paper in laws, but are respected in their actual interpersonal interactions with others in their society. And ultimately, so is some sort of political change that gets rid of certain types of concentrated power that enables people to engage in oppressive and repressive violence against those who are vulnerable, right? Because as long as you have a world where, you know, ICE agents and border patrol agents can send people to essentially a death sentence in an illiberal society, that type of discretionary power is going to be a threat to the freedom of LGBTQ people, even if we've built up very robust cultural institutions, even if we have excellent LGBTQ businesses, and even if we have formally equal laws on the books. And so I think an all of the above approach that gets egalitarian laws that respect equal protection for all people and respect the formal equality of all people, liberal institutions that enable social and economic experimentation and the robust formation of diverse communities and productive projects, and efforts to limit or abolish the power of certain forms of concentrated repressive power. All of that is important for LGBTQ emancipation and flourishing.
I think I have one last question before we conclude. What is one major misunderstanding about markets and LGBTQ freedom that you would like to correct?
That's a great question. I think a major misunderstanding I'd like to correct is that I think a lot of people either see markets as a institution that is threatened by LGBTQ radicals because they see LGBTQ people as just part of the left and they see the left as a threat to markets. So that's a misconception on the conservative side. And the flip side misconception on the LGBTQ left is that markets are solely or primarily a site of oppression for queer and trans people, that markets are a space where rapacious bosses and landlords are just engaged in oppression of vulnerable queer and trans workers and tenants and so on, right? And that's not to say that no oppression happens in markets. It does, right? There is a very real set of power disparities that exists in actually existing markets a lot of the time. But markets are also sites of community formation. They're social spaces where people can form places for those who are different from the dominant culture to express themselves, to find like-minded people, and to build community. And ultimately, because markets enable entrepreneurial experimentation, markets are a source of emancipation and dissent. They're a social space for emancipation and dissent. Schumpeter wrote of a gale of creative destruction, destroying old methods of production. Well, a gale of creative destruction can also destroy old repressive social institutions and stigmas by giving people a space to try out entrepreneurial projects that will enable them to live together and pursue their projects, their relationships, their identities, their communities in ways they want to live, not ways that old traditions said they should live. And so that gale of creative destruction is something that I think gets underappreciated because appreciation of markets gets so tied to appreciation of tradition due to a certain kind of right-wing fusionism, and appreciation of social emancipation gets so tied to a critique of oppression within markets that type of cultural creative destruction gets missed. And so that, I think, is what I want people to understand and appreciate the value of.
I hope this podcast adds to that conversation and like creatively destroy those narratives as well. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much for joining for the first episode of Homocapitalism. This conversation gave us exactly the foundation I wanted. Markets, institutions, identity, freedom, and the serious question of how LGBTQ emancipation actually happens was very well explained. Thank you everyone for listening. This has been Homocapitalism, a podcast on markets, liberalism, and LGBTQ freedom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Creatively destroying.
Exactly. A gale of it.
Thank you so much, Nathan. See you soon.
Thank you. See you soon. Have a great week.